So here's a question I get quite a bit, which is this idea of, can a grown adult just turn narcissistic one day? Basically, the question is, can a person who is actually kind of agreeable, generally well-regulated, empathic, kind of feels normal, they're not grandiose, can a person with that kind of a personality just boom, turn narcissistic during their adulthood? Probably not. Personality, to understand personality, you have to understand consistency, right? An occasional warm day in the winter in a cold climate doesn't mean that it is now summer, right? But personality change rarely happens. And when it does, it's often the result, either in adulthood, of some harm to the brain, an injury, a stroke, or something like that, or what we call post-traumatic personality change. A person experiences a significant trauma and their personality changes. So we're either talking what we call about an organic injury, something actually their brain gets damaged, or something terrible happens, right? Really bad. Now, if one of those two things has happened, right? And listen, having an injury to your brain is also traumatic. And then we see a sudden personality change in someone. It's possible that we can see a shift in personality that is very different than the person's original one, but then we'll see that this event happened, and that's what happened. In fact, when I've trained students, I tell them rapid, quick shifts in personality are a clear sign that a person needs to seek medical care as soon as possible. Depending on where the brain injury occurs within a brain, that can have bearing on the types of personality changes we can see. Any of you who have spent time with somebody who might have had a stroke, for example, you might have seen changes in personality. Now, especially when the frontal lobes, this front part of the brain is affected, this is when we are most likely to see noticeable personality change. And frankly, when there's injury up here, the changes tend to be in the not healthy direction, more dysregulation, impulsivity, abrupt anger. And it's frankly stuff that looks more antagonistic, right? Now, in the cases of other kinds of trauma, and here's where we're going to put psychological trauma, right? We can also see personality change. And people who are experiencing acute traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress, that can look like avoidance, edginess, anger, withdrawing from other people, impulsivity, numbing, a narrowness of emotion. And some of that stuff, not all of it, but some of it can look and feel antagonistic. But there is also strong literature suggesting something called post-traumatic growth, which sort of translates into sort of a personality change into a more healthy, resilient, pro-social place. Other research that has looked at personality change over the lifespan even suggests that therapy that's focused on attachment and development and personality stuff can result in some shift. And we can see through therapy a person who now flexes into new personality spaces. My read on that particular treatment literature is that these shifts are most often seen in people who did not have antagonistic styles to start with. And it requires the person making pretty significant commitment to working on empathy, regulation, and attachment in therapy. Now, all of that said, without some major stuff happening in an adult's life, personality does not just change. Okay, it's a very stable characteristic. This question does come sometimes up from folks who will say, you know what, Doc? The first year, the first 3 years, the first 5 years of this relationship, they were actually kind of fine. Like the longest time I have to say in all my years of doing this work, I've ever had someone say that their relationship was fine and then showed itself as being very narcissistic and that they didn't notice narcissistic stuff was 9 years. But when I really got into it with this was from a person who did not clock her partner's entitlement, grandiosity, and his sort of flirty extroversion as a problem until he had an affair and then blamed her for it. Now, lots of people who have been in narcissistic relationships also wonder, could I turn narcissistic just out of the blue? Again, short of the whole head injury, severe trauma, post-traumatic personality shift, no. But the impact of especially long-term emotional abuse on you could result in you feeling as though you are more dysregulated at times, or you feel shut down, or you can't manage strong emotions as well as you once could. or you feel a sense of compassion fatigue that translates into you feeling that you're not as empathic as you could be. Many people who are in narcissistic relationships, you're often also told that you're the problem, that you're the one who's narcissistic, you're the one who's mean, you're the one who's manipulative, right? So what happens to folks in narcissistic relationships is that your ability to manage emotional stress can often get worn down because the emotional stress coming at you is relentless. And you find yourself often bouncing between numbness and at times where your anger pops through and you feel like you can't even control it at those times. That's not narcissism if it's not been long-standing and it's largely in response to the singular situation of your relationship. This question about whether people can become narcissistic in adulthood most often comes, though, from people who felt that they kind of had a nice thing going with a narcissistic person until they didn't. And they'll wonder what changed. Well, I'll tell you the thing that changed. The thing that changed is that enough time passed. In a way, in many ways, it's exhausting for a narcissistic person to mask and love bomb and be regulated long enough to win someone over. Typically, that only lasts a few months. But after a few months, especially if there's other things you really like about this person, you may be in it deep enough at that point that you're already making excuses for them, justifying, thinking, well, this is a human relationship. Nobody's perfect. It's not always going to be easy. I can't be unrealistic. And then obviously the math shifts in the relationship, and then it goes from bad or uncomfortable or abusive a few times to a lot of the time, which is around the time that you wonder if a person could just become narcissistic in adulthood. No, it was always there. It was better masked. It was new. And you were also doing some of the heavy lifting of justifying. Now, personality tends to shift and grow and develop across a childhood and into adulthood. Childhood personalities are very sort of, as this brain develops, so too does personality. Now, the healthier the personality, by healthy we mean well-regulated, pro-social, aware of others, flexible, emotionally self-reflective, empathic, open, curious. The more flexibility there is, frankly, the more you might actually see some changes in a personality. For example, a person who might go from less sort of tender-hearted to saying, oh, this isn't okay. Now, the less healthy, there's our antagonistic folks, the less healthy the personality, the lower the self-awareness, the lower the ability to regulate, and the tendency to rely on primitive defenses to stay psychologically safe. And these include also things like blaming other people and projection, and to rely on grandiose defenses, thinking they're all that and that they deserve special treatment. These are almost more stunted personalities. And because antagonistic personalities often have less capacity to look inwards, there's going to be less likelihood of a change. Listen, I am not a fan of commenting on personalities being really stable and consistent until a person has gotten well into their mid-20s. Around that time, the frontal lobe development is pretty much, we're sort of there. But the brain develops through the lifespan. And remember, during adolescence, depending on the relationship you have with a given adolescent, a lot of teenagers and adolescents look narcissistic to their parents. But perhaps they don't look like that to their friends. So I often tell parents of teenagers, we do have to let some of that developmental stuff sort of shake out and figure out how they are with other people, because they might be really nice to their friends, but really awful to you. So no, a person will not go from a healthy personality, an agreeable personality, a conscientious personality to narcissistic in adulthood. It's certainly not quickly. It's just not something we see. And even in those situations where there may be personality changes due to physical or psychological trauma or both, we are still not likely to see a person become narcissistic per se. But what we may see is shifts into a more combative, more hostile, more impulsive personality that in some cases may look like narcissism, but you may not see higher order things like skilled manipulation or gaslighting. But odds are that head injury thing is not what happened in your life, in your narcissistic relationship. So no, this wasn't an absolutely lovely, well put together person who turned narcissistic. This is a person where these traits and patterns were there and were likely popping up here and there, But for a variety of reasons, your own personal history, society, culture, trauma bonding, excuses were made. But remember, narcissistic relationships can be quite gradual. So we don't notice the narcissistic personality until we hit critical mass. But in most cases, it was there all along. So personality is tricky, and there was a study that came out in 2024 that suggested that narcissism and these qualities, these traits, definitely hang together for the long term. If anything, we see a little bit of softening in older age, which, again, older people are also less vulnerable to depression. There's a little more circumspection that comes with age. I just think you have more data. But we can see that an older person may develop dementia or have a stroke, where we can see a personality switch. But we have that event to see that happening. So all of this can be very confusing if you're really in it with someone and you see their personality change. But no, it wasn't as though some sort of narcissism fairy flew into their head, or whatever demon flew into their head in the middle of the night and changed their personality. While at times these relationships can feel like a horror film, that's not how personality works. It was always there, and it can be difficult because a lot of people saying, if it was always there and I missed it, what's wrong with me? Nothing's wrong with you. We are little heat-seeking attachment creatures. We want to connect. We want to attach. We want to love. We want to be with other people. And when somebody initially really seems attentive and attuned and interesting, or even someone who just brings up good feelings in you, you're attracted to, we tend to fight for that from an attachment-oriented place. And sometimes attachment means, whether for a child or an adult, that we have to ignore the stuff that makes us uncomfortable. Unfortunately, in narcissism, that always comes back to bite you in the ass. Thanks again.